What's good, guys? It's Rey-Jay back with another video, and this one we're breaking down what's going on with SPY, Nvidia, Tesla, the QQQ, and many tickers out there. I'm going to break down why tomorrow is going to be a very big day since we have so many options expirations on SPY, and what the options chain is actually suggesting in terms of the open interest and volume. I'm also going to break down what's going on with the earnings coming out for tomorrow, what data could be dropping, and how all of this could affect the market going into tomorrow based off all these factors and the technicals. But before I break anything down about all these different tickers, let me just mention a couple of things. I'm personally not a financial planner, so make sure you take none of this as financial advice. And also, if you guys can, please check out the Webull link, which is down below and in the description. If you sign up for Webull, the link down below, and deposit any amount of money into the account, you are guaranteed up to 12 free stocks. The offer ends very soon, so check it out before they run out. With that out of the way, let's get on with the video. All right, so when it comes to SPY, let's break down something very important that was going on. I mentioned to you guys that we had this head and shoulders like setup, but you want to remember that this overall formation is looking quite symmetrical, right? The resistance right here where the shoulders are was symmetrical, which tells us that this overall starting point, which is where we have an imbalance on the 4-hour time frame, happens to be our major support at this 450 level, and there's a good chance we could be testing that very soon. But the option chain does give us more insights about why that is, and I'm going to talk about that in just a few minutes. But first, let's talk about the market, what happened for today. For today, we saw a big reaction after the tech earnings that came out yesterday. Netflix and Tesla absolutely fell in a very, very strong manner, and we continue to see Tesla just tank today. Now, why was that? That's because Tesla reported some guidance that was not as strong as what we expected, not as strong as what analysts wanted, and it led to more fears about how on earth the next quarter is going to look. Tesla was telling us that production may be cut for Q3, and they mentioned that there could be more pain coming for the future quarters, but they also talked about how the long term is very bright nonetheless. With potential pains coming to margins and other things like that, this is leading to more fear in the markets, and this led to a big shift in sentiment. Also, more fear about other earnings, which are similar to Tesla. For that reason, Tesla played a big role in why the market performed the way it did. And Tesla selling off had a big impact on the whole market, which led to more selling pressure. Now, for tomorrow, we don't really have any major pieces of data that's going to be coming out. I just want to note that. So that's not going to dictate the market. What's going to dictate the market is going to be the options chains, not to mention how the whole market reacts to earnings coming out, and also the technicals. Those are going to be the bigger things for tomorrow. Now, let me just mention that for today, we have Capital One releasing earnings in just a few minutes. I think the actual call is going to start in a couple of hours, though. Just a couple of banks coming out, but nothing as significant as what we saw yesterday. And then we have American Express, and just a couple of other big ones coming out for Friday, but nothing like insanely huge compared to like Tesla. But let me just remind you guys that even though this week had some big earnings, the really big earnings are going to be coming out for next week. So next week we have Microsoft, we have Google, and we have a couple of others. Those are going to be a lot more important, so watch those very, very carefully. But for now, let's talk about the options. Let's talk about SPY, what's going on with tomorrow, why is it such a big day? We have loads of options expirations as it's going to be the third close of the month of July for our Friday. And you will notice that right here, we have a max pain of 435. We have a 2.67 put to call ratio with us being 3.99% above max pain. Let me also add that we have about 1.3, a little bit under 1.3 million calls expiring, and we have about 3.4 plus million puts expiring, around that many. So the majority of the positions are going to be on the put side. The majority of individuals and institutions have puts, but we're already well above max pain, which is at 435. Now, the reason why it's so low is because a lot of these options were bought a long time ago because these were used for like hedging, repositioning, and for other moves by these institutions. For that reason, right now, I believe that we're well above max pain, so the market makers will be fine with whatever happens, right? If the market tries to pump a little bit more, right, the market makers are going to be okay. But if they try to drop it more, they would be completely fine with that as well. Now, because we're still above max pain, one of the things I want to mention is that there's so many puts out of the money, and the bears are coming in a little bit harder. The bears may try to double down and bring the market down, and the market makers may be completely fine with that. So I think they're going to try to get more of these puts in the money, at least some of them, and there's a good chance they may try to fight back, especially for tomorrow. I'm not just saying this based off this chart, it's also based off the options chain. As of right now, this is what the options chain is looking like for SPY. On the call side, I just want to mention that what's very important to look at is going to be volume and open interest. And we have the highest open interest in the current range we're in around this 450 area. And we happen to have the highest amount of volume around this, like the much higher levels, like 455 or so. So people holding those are likely going to be in a bad position. I don't really think the market's going to go all the way up to like 455 or so looking at the current trend. If anything, there's going to be a lot of interest right here at this 450 area because of the high open interest. So I'm going to be watching this level very carefully. But another level that's very important would be like around, 455 if they do try to like pump us all the way up there, which I highly doubt. I think that's very unlikely unless we get some crazy catalyst, which I'm not really seeing so far. So I'm going to be eyeing this 450 area because of this current chain. But looking at the put side, looking at the options for the puts, this is pretty insane because when you look carefully at this, you look at the options expirations, okay? Right now, I'm not seeing anything too crazy, at least at the current levels. There's very high volume at the current levels we're at, but there happens to be very high volume. What just happened? Sorry about that, guys. I think my page just reloaded or something. Anyways, going back right here, looking at the volume, it was at about 166,000 for this 450 strike on the put side. And then for the open interest side, so right here, we have about 55,000. So this is going to be a very important level that the market makers are going to be looking at because we have very high open interest. In fact, the highest open interest in the current range and a lot of volume around that area. That's very important because the market makers are going to be eyeing this level. They may even try to target this area, this 450 area. That's going to be very important for tomorrow. Now, it's not just the options chain that's suggesting this. It's not just looking at the other factors, but it's also because of this. When you look at SPY, like I was saying earlier, okay, this overall trend is looking symmetrical, meaning we have this resistance, or we had this resistance at a very similar place for the left shoulder and the right shoulder. And then the support, which started this trend up, was around this 450 area. 450 is going to be an important target for tomorrow. So my gut is telling me that the market might actually gap up tomorrow morning, right? During the pre-market, we might see the market try to hold up because on the 5-minute time frame, we actually have a very tiny looking bounce that formed this nice like inverse head and shoulders. So we might gap up in the pre-market. That's what I'm guessing or predicting. And then we might start to sell off even more because of this imbalance down here. We saw this very, very big change in volume, and we have this head and shoulders, which is still valid. The head and shoulders is not complete yet. It's going to be complete at 450 on SPY. So my gut tells me that what's going to happen is we gap up tomorrow, we start selling off a little bit more, and we're going to be testing this 200 EMA. This is going to be on the 30 minutes time frame around this 451 area. If it breaks, if 451 breaks going into tomorrow, we're going to most likely come down into the very low 450s. And 450 specifically is going to be a very important support. Now, we could try to base there because of the market makers looking at the options chain. They have a lot of interest to do so. We may close around there too, maybe a little bit above it. But the thing is, there's no guarantee it's going to hold because of how violent the market could be sometimes. So if that were to break, you're going to be watching 448, then maybe a bounce there. So what I'm seeing basically is the market gapping up, selling off to either 450 or even 448, one of those two, then trying to bounce afterwards, and us closing very close to like 450 or so. The odds do favor that based off the option chain in the current time, but this could always change intraday. So we'll wait and see on that. For now, that's what I think is very likely. I think the market's not done yet with the selling pressure, and this is just very important to note. Now, when it comes to how the market's going to move moving forward, don't forget we have some earnings coming out before the market opens, but this overall trend is not as significant compared to next week because you have to remember we have big tech earnings next week, which will determine how the market moves. We have Google, we have not to mention Amazon, and just a couple of others. We have Microsoft too. That's going to be very big for the market, so be ready for that for next week. But anyways, now let's talk about the charts. What do I think is going to happen? I told you my prediction for SPY, but what about for Tesla? The thing about Tesla was I told you that we had this unfilled gap at this 262 area, and if anything, Tesla would likely come to that level, and that's where Tesla went to. 262 is where it closed at. Could Tesla bounce here? It's a possibility, but the problem is it's not giving us any signal of a bounce just yet. So what I'm starting to think is we might gap up in the pre-markets tomorrow. We might open a little bit higher, and then we might see Tesla continue to sell off a little bit, but we're going to be watching, could Tesla try to bounce around 262? If it fails to do so, I'm going to be watching 260 258, and then potentially a test. If 258 breaks, then there's going to be 255, then the 200 EMA test on the 4 hour around this 251 area. So it could come all the way down to like the 250s, mid 250s, if not the lower ones, if we get a clean break below 260. So that's going to be a very important test for tomorrow. And once again, guys, the chart just it doesn't really give us any signal of a bounce. Okay, there's no true signal of a bounce. It's still looking bearish. Could gap up tomorrow morning because once again we sold off so hard. That's what typically happens. But then we're going to be watching for a true bounce or not by the time we open. It's still looking weak, so I can't really call a true like big uptrend or anything like that just yet. And the odds do favor a little bit more downside looking at the bearish momentum that could perpetuate. So I'm going to be watching this 260 area. Could Tesla try to base around there? Could it try to bounce? If not, 258, 255, and then potentially 251 could come for it. And then it should bounce. If it does drop that hard, it should bounce around like 251. That's going to be a very important support for it. So we're gonna be watching that area very carefully just to be safe. I want to make that clear. That's what I'm seeing for Tesla, but it's not the end of the world. Now, if somehow there's some very bullish news that comes out tomorrow or something like that, well, let's just say hypothetically that were to happen. I'm not really predicting it based off the current trend, but let's just say it does happen. Here are some resistance levels to watch for. If it pushes up, you're going to be watching 265, 268, 270, 272, and then 275 as our resistances. As a lot of resistance above, it's just blasted below all of these. But like I said before, what I think is very likely is it's going to try to gap up somewhere in the mid 260s, if not a little bit higher than that, then make its way down lower. And we're going to get a retest of like 262 or so, maybe even a lower level just based off technicals. And if it breaks, it could fall a lot more and then try to bounce at the very end of the day. But this all depends on the news coming out for tomorrow and what the trend looks like. Right now, at the time I'm recording this, it's still looking more bearish. Okay, that's going to be very important to note. For something else like Aapl, let me just mention that Aapl is still looking stagnant. I called this out earlier. I said Aapl was looking like it's going to try to hold up. It's still very stagnant, going back and forth and back and forth. Zooming out of it, let me just show you what I'm talking about. This is what Aapl looks like. You could see it's very stationary, going back and forth between support at 192.5 and resistance tends to be around like 195 or so. It did go a little bit above it temporarily after some bullish news came out, but Aapl did slow down today. And I told you that a very important support to watch for in Aapl 192.5. That's the low of the day for Aapl exactly. The question is, how is Aapl going to look? Well, if Aapl tries to bounce, right, you're going to be watching 193.5, 194, 195, and then 195.67, and then 196.5 as our resistances. And support is going to be 192.5. It has to hold that. If it fails, it's going to come all the way down to 190. What do I think this is going to do? I'm going to be looking for a potential gap up, looking at this inverse head and shoulders that formed in the pre-market. I think the market's going to try to bounce in the morning, then start selling off even more. I think Apple's going to get a retest of 192.5 ultimately. Now, if it holds or not, that depends heavily on how it moves tomorrow and the news that comes out and earnings and all those other factors. I'm going to be watching for a retest. It might hold. So far, it's holding, but just in case if it breaks, it's going to sink the market even lower. So just be very careful with Aapl. Watch 192.5 if it does come down there again after getting a bounce in the morning, then coming back down. And we will wait and see on that. I'm not 100% sure about that specifically, but I'm a little bit cautious watching how it moves from there. Because if it breaks this level, it's going to come down and it's going to drag the entire market down with it. Apple's very powerful. Now, for the triple Q, this is looking weaker than SPY in my opinion. Here's why. This 4-hour time frame is showing us a bearish divergence that's playing out. And on top of this, on the current trend, we have this unfilled gap around this 373 area. So could this bounce in the pre-market? Yes, it might bounce just a little bit, get a back to something like 378 or so. But then I see this potentially cooling off even more and making its way down to 373. I still have that target in mind. It's still looking bearish on the 4-hour time frame. The 30-minute is still looking bearish as well. There's just no true sign of a bounce on it, no like real confirmation just yet as the trend is looking bearish. And I'm going to be watching 373 on the triple Q. Now, here are some specific levels to watch for when it comes to the way this thing is going to move. Just to be safe, if it does bounce a little bit, we have resistance around 377.2, 377.8, 379, and then 380 as our resistance zones. For support, you're going to be watching 375, this entire 375 zone, and below that, if it fails, if it breaks the low it made today, that's it. It's going to go down to 373 in my opinion. That's going to be the next like support zone. There's also support at 372.5, but like I said before, that's going to be your big confirmation or break of the low of today. If that happens tomorrow, that's it. It's going to sink down lower, and that's going to drag the market down with it, at least to some degree. Now, what about Nvidia? How is Nvidia looking? We had 450 today. This was the support I called out. If it broke below 455, I told you to watch 452 or so. If that failed us, then there's like 450. We saw Nvidia bounce off that. It's trying to base around this area, but for now, the trend is still looking a little bit more bearish. It hasn't really gotten us a very strong bounce just yet, but this could happen tomorrow. And I'm starting to think that Nvidia is going to try to base because you could see it form kind of like a double bottom here. We might see buyers trying to defend 450. So going into tomorrow, I think it's going to bounce in the pre-market, get a retest of a much better level like 458 or so, maybe even 460, then reject off that and come down to like 455 or so, and just kind of trade sideways going into tomorrow. That's what I'm leaning towards. Now, this could change if we do break below 450, but we have some nice support here. You could see it bounced off here many times before. So Nvidia is going to try to hold up, in my opinion. But if it were to break 450, just hypothetically, let's just say that does happen, you're going to be watching 444 specifically. It's going to be a very important support for it. I don't think it's going to drop that low unless something bad happens, unless the market's very bearish. But for now, I think that the trend was looking bearish. It's going to likely get a retest of like 450 or so. It might gap up, then come right back down. But then there's no confirmation of it breaking 450. Even though the trend is looking a little bit weak, I don't see it breaking 450 yet. And if that does happen, that's going to be your confirmation of more downside. But like I said before about Nvidia, this is a monster. It's a very strong stock. Even if it falls down to the 440s, I don't care. I see this thing running, approaching its earnings next month. I think it's going to run very nicely in August. It's going to take some time to get there, of course, right? We have some time until August. But until then, I still see this thing with lots and lots of potential. We're going to be watching this carefully. Watch 450 very carefully on this thing. Going to be looking for a gap up tomorrow, then a slowdown as time goes on. Maybe a retest of 450. You may try to hold that very nicely since we're forming like a double bottom. We have nice support there. But if it breaks, there could be a lot more downside to like 444 or so coming. It's not that bad. Like I said before, it's only down 3%. That is still nothing compared to what Nvidia could do. This thing could run 8%, 5% very easily. It's a very strong stock, very volatile. So that's my point with Nvidia. No matter how much it drops, I'm still bullish going into earnings. That's going to be fine for it. Now, for Microsoft, it's not looking that great. This thing continued to sell off today, and we have this imbalance down here all the way down to about 344. So I'm going to be watching for a potential bounce, retest of like 348 or so, maybe even 350. I'm not too sure about that. But then it may continue to sell off and come down to about 344. So a little bit lower for Microsoft, but then I think it's going to try to bounce somewhere between 342.5 to 344 around there. Then I think it's just going to trade very similar to the market and trade sideways around there. That's what I'm leaning towards on Microsoft. For AMD, this is once again, it actually ended up getting a big rejection off this area in the pre-market and ended up just selling off. And then right here, it just continued to sell off with tech moving forward. So I'm going to be watching this very important support right here around this 109 area. I know it's a little hard to see, but it actually bounced off 109 many times in the past. So I'm going to be watching for a bounce in the pre-market, a retest of like 112 or so. And then if it rejects off that, we're going to be watching a retest of potentially these lower levels and then maybe a bounce. It could try to bounce off 109, or it might just end up breaking below it. If it breaks below it, it could make its way closer to 107 and potentially 105. Now, to add on to this, when it comes to Netflix hit this low at 430, and I told you it would likely try to bounce around there and try to hold up. Looking at Netflix, it is still getting very tight. I don't really see a whole lot coming out for tomorrow. It might just continue to stay in this range between 430 and about this like 440 area, going back and forth and back and forth. I think Netflix is going to continue to do this and try to consolidate a bit. And we're going to see if this thing can get a bounce later on. But for now, it still is not looking very strong just yet. The HYG is kind of down, which is once again a bearish signal for the markets. It's continuing to drop in the after hours, which could lead to more selling pressure for tomorrow. The Nasdaq is still looking kind of weak. As you can see on the 4-hour time frame, it's approaching this 50 EMA, or at least getting very close to it. This support zone. It also has this unfilled gap down here. So if it does break below 14,000 flat, it's going to come all the way down to 13,900, if not 13,769 or around that area. I'm not counting on 13,700, but I could see it retesting 14,000 flat tomorrow. If that breaks, right? It's going to be a bearish signal for the markets, and we can see 13,900, which is going to once again be bearish. On SPX, we're going to be watching how does SPX move. If it gets a bearish cross on the 4-hour time frame, we could see a little bit more downside. We might see a retest of 4,500 on it if that ends up being the case. That's just where gap support happens to be. Now, if we happen to break below 4,500, we're going to likely start filling these gaps down here, like 44.7, the 44.70s, and not to mention 44. There's also one at 44.39, but no guarantees about that one just yet. That's going to depend a lot on tech earnings. But for now, it is looking more bearish. It looks like it might have a little bit more downside. It's going to drag SPY down a little bit more. That's what I'm seeing so far. Now, what's interesting is the dollar isn't really doing much. It did pump just a little bit, but it came right back down over the last couple of hours. But overall, the dollar is up a little bit, and that's contributing to why the market is down the way it is. The dollar also happens to have this imbalance around this 101.5 area. If it keeps going up higher, this could be bearish for the stock market. That's a real possibility moving forward. Google was looking quite weak today. It actually got a break below this trend. One of the things I called out a couple of days ago was I was saying Google's looking bearish to me. This thing was curling, forming a head and shoulders, and that is what Google has been doing. Now, looking forward at it, we're going to be watching this imbalance right here around this 118 level. It may bounce in the pre-market, then come all the way down to 118, then try to bounce off that. But if 118 fails us, we're going to be watching it get very close to this 116 zone. That's where we have this nice zone, potential support. So we're going to be watching these levels very carefully. I believe it's going to try to bounce in the pre-market and end up coming all the way down to about this very important imbalance around this 118 area. So watch those very carefully, and we will see how it moves after that. As far as Amazon goes, this thing is looking kind of weak. I called this out earlier as well. It's going to try to bounce, maybe get a retest of about 131, then fail after that. And we could see it sell off a little bit more as the trend is looking very bearish. If it sells off a lot more, we're going to be watching this thing come all the way down to about this 128 area, 128.5 or so. And if that fails us, there's also this like previous support around 127.5, and then below that comes 126. It's looking kind of weak right now. We could see a bounce in the pre-market, then a continuation down to at least 128.5. That's what I'm leaning towards. Then it may try to base around there. For Meta, this was also looking weak once again, getting very close to our 300 target since it broke below 305. Looking at this, it may try to bounce and retest 305 in the pre-market, then come all the way down to about 300. And then we're going to be watching how it reacts to many of these support zones. But for now, that's what I'm seeing from Meta. It's looking kind of weak right now in the 4-hour time frame. Could see a small bounce in the pre-market, then continue dropping. And then overall, it's still looking kind of weak. So watch 300, see if we could try to hold that. If it fails, then 298 becomes very possible for it. All right, so that's what I'm seeing for the market, guys. It's going to be a very interesting day. The market's already starting to push a little bit in the after hours for the time being. You could see that. So I am anticipating a potential nice little like gap up tomorrow, then I think the market has more potential selling pressure that's going to be emerging tomorrow. 450 is going to be a very important level on the options chain based off the strikes we're seeing and the amount of open interest. And despite all the puts expiring on SPY, I don't think we're going to see a short squeeze or anything like that. The trends look quite bearish for the time being. We're well above max pain, and the market makers could afford to see the market drop a bit. It's not going to really affect them that much since the market is so up there. Now, to add on to this, don't forget, there's so many puts out of the money on SPY. They're going to try, in my opinion, to get some of these puts in the money. They're going to make an attempt to do so. They're going to try fighting. So watch for a potential gap up, then a potential drop tomorrow. And we're going to be watching if 450 holds on SPY. If not, 448 becomes possible. And regardless of how low it goes, I'm going to be watching for a potential bounce of either like 448 or 450 for the market to try to hold or base around those levels. And then we're going to close very close to that, in my opinion, maybe close to like 450. That's my prediction. But once again, things could change intraday depending on how the news goes. That's what I'm seeing for now. And please watch all of these levels very carefully, especially going into tomorrow. All right. So with that said, thank you for listening. Have an absolutely spectacular rest of the day. Remain calm, cool, and collected, and I'll see you guys in the next one. The market to the moon is the long term is still incredibly bright despite all this news that's coming out. And peace out.